The transport shuttle hummed through the void between stars, carrying its precious cargo toward the most prestigious military academy in the galaxy. Inside the cramped passenger compartment, dozens of alien cadets from various species sat in tense silence, each one hand-picked from billions of candidates across their home worlds. The Galactic Defense Academy only accepted the finest warriors, the most brilliant tactical minds, and the strongest specimens their species could offer. Among the towering Krathari with their chitinous armor plating, the graceful Valerians with their 4 arms and crystalline skin, and the hulking Gorvani whose muscles rippled beneath thick hide, sat a single human girl who looked impossibly out of place. Elena Vasquez appeared no older than 17 standard years, with delicate features, large brown eyes, and shoulder-length dark hair that she kept tucked behind her ears nervously. At barely 5 feet tall and weighing perhaps 100 pounds soaking wet, she seemed like a clerical error rather than a legitimate cadet. The Krathari warrior beside her, Thexamore, clicked his mandibles in what passed for laughter among his kind. His exoskeleton gleamed like polished obsidian, and each of his 4 arms ended in razor-sharp claws that could slice through reinforced steel. He had earned his place at the academy by single-handedly defeating a nest of void spiders that had been terrorizing his home colony for months. "Tell me, little human," Thexamore chittered, his voice like grinding stone, "what clerical mistake brought you here? Perhaps you meant to apply for the Galactic Culinary Institute instead." Several other aliens turned to watch the exchange, their various eyes, optical sensors, and heat-detecting organs focusing on Elena. A Valerian named Cithara let out a melodic trill that served as her species' version of laughter. Her crystalline skin shifted from blue to purple, indicating amusement. She had been selected after demonstrating the ability to coordinate 17 different battlefield scenarios simultaneously using her species' unique parallel processing capabilities. Elena looked up from the datapad she had been studying, her expression calm despite the obvious mockery. "I applied to the right place," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the shuttle's engines. "Though I appreciate your concern for my academic choices." A massive Gorvani named Brutok, whose species communicated primarily through subsonic rumbles, let out what could only be described as a snort. His people had evolved on a high-gravity world where the atmospheric pressure would crush most beings instantly. Brutok had qualified for the academy by surviving 3 months alone on a death world, with nothing but his bare hands and primitive tools. "Humans," he rumbled in heavily accented galactic standard, "always think they belong everywhere. Your species has only been spacefaring for what, 200 years? Most of us have civilizations older than your entire recorded history." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "That's true. We are quite young compared to most galactic civilizations. I suppose that makes us rather inexperienced." Her mild agreement seemed to take some of the wind out of their sails. Thexamore had expected defensiveness or anger, emotional responses that would justify further ridicule. Instead, the human girl simply returned to studying her datapad with the same quiet focus she had maintained throughout the journey. Cithara tilted her head, her crystalline features shifting to a curious orange hue. "What are you reading that is so fascinating, human? Last-minute cramming for basic physics, perhaps?" Elena glanced up again, and for just a moment something flickered behind her dark eyes that made Cithara's skin shift involuntarily to yellow, the color of unease among her people. But the expression was gone so quickly that the Valerian convinced herself she had imagined it. "Advanced tactical theory," Elena replied. "I find the mathematical models for multi-dimensional battlefield analysis quite interesting. Professor Kethvar's work on quantum probability matrices in combat scenarios is particularly elegant." The shuttle fell silent. Professor Kethvar was a legendary strategist whose theoretical work was considered graduate-level material, even for the most advanced students. His quantum probability matrices were so complex that most species required neural enhancement implants just to comprehend the basic concepts. Brutok's massive brow furrowed. "You understand Kethvar's matrices?" "The basic principles, yes. Though I find his assumptions about enemy behavior patterns somewhat limited. He tends to assume rational actors operating with complete information, which rarely applies in actual combat situations. Now even the pilot, a grizzled Centaurian veteran with cybernetic implants covering half his skull, was listening. In his 40 years of flying military personnel, he had never heard a cadet, much less a human cadet, casually critique one of the galaxy's foremost military theorists. Thexmore's mandibles stopped clicking. Among his people, academic achievement was nearly as valued as physical prowess, and what the human girl had just said demonstrated a level of intellectual sophistication that few beings achieved even after decades of study. "Perhaps," he said more carefully, "you could explain where you believe Kethvar's theories fall short?" Elena looked up again, and this time Cythera was certain she saw something dangerous in those seemingly innocent brown eyes. The human girl seemed to consider the question seriously before responding. "Well, for instance, his Matrix 7 assumes that all combatants will prioritize survival above mission objectives. But that fails to account for species like yours, Thexmore, where individual sacrifice for the greater good is not just accepted, but expected. Or species like the Gorvani, where personal honor often outweighs tactical considerations. And it completely ignores the possibility of irrational actors, beings who might choose seemingly suicidal tactics not out of desperation, but as part of a larger psychological warfare strategy." The shuttle's cabin had gone completely quiet, except for the steady hum of the engines. Elena's analysis was not only correct but demonstrated an understanding of interspecies psychology that most xenobiologists would envy. "How?" Cythera asked, her skin now a confused swirl of colors. "Does a human girl barely out of adolescence possess such knowledge?" Elena smiled for the first time since boarding the shuttle, and somehow that expression was more unsettling than anything that had come before. "I read a lot," she said simply as the massive bulk of the Galactic Defense Academy came into view, a sprawling complex of interconnected stations that could house 50,000 cadets and faculty. Elena returned to her datapad, but now the other passengers found themselves stealing glances at the small human girl, wondering what else they might have misjudged about her. The transport docked with a slight shudder, and automated systems began cycling through landing procedures. In moments, they would disembark and begin the most challenging military training program in the known galaxy. As they gathered their belongings, none of the alien cadets paid much attention to Elena's simple duffel bag or her worn, unremarkable clothing. They would learn soon enough that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving. The orientation ceremony took place in the Academy's Grand Assembly, a massive amphitheater that could accommodate representatives from over 300 different species. Holographic displays showed real-time feeds from across the galaxy, reminding the new cadets of the constant threats that made their training necessary. Void hunters prowled the outer rim, consuming entire solar systems. The hegemony of steel continued its relentless expansion, turning conquered worlds into mechanized wastelands. And in the deep dark between galaxies, ancient things stirred that made both of those threats seem trivial by comparison. Elena sat in the section designated for humanoid species, her small frame dwarfed by beings that towered over her even while seated. The Academy's commandant, a draconian whose scales had turned silver with age, and whose ceremonial armor bore the scars of countless battles, began the traditional address that had been given to new cadets for over 1,000 years. "You come here as representatives of your species," his voice boomed through the translator system, automatically adjusting to each species' optimal hearing range. "You believe you are warriors. You believe you are scholars. You believe you are the finest specimens your worlds can produce." His reptilian eyes swept across the assembled cadets with predatory intensity. "You are wrong. You are nothing. You are soft, untested civilians who happen to possess certain genetic advantages or intellectual capabilities. Over the next 4 years, we will either forge you into instruments of galactic defense, or you will fail and return home with the knowledge that, when the galaxy's survival was at stake, you were found wanting." Elena listened with the same quiet attention she had shown on the transport, but several of the cadets around her shifted uncomfortably. The commandant's reputation was legendary. He had personally led the defense of the Kepler Nebula against a void hunter swarm, holding the line for 6 months with nothing but a handful of Academy graduates and outdated equipment until reinforcements could arrive. "Your first test begins now," the commandant continued. "You will be divided into integrated units of 12 cadets each, representing different species and specializations. These will be your squads for the duration of your time here. Success or failure, you will face it together. Elena found herself assigned to Squad Gamma 7, along with Thexmore, Cithara, and Brutok from the transport, plus 8 other cadets she hadn't met. There was Zephyr, an Etherian whose gaseous form was contained within a sophisticated environmental suit that allowed her to interact with solid matter. The Etherians were master scouts and infiltrators, capable of passing through spaces barely large enough for air molecules. Korath represented the Stoneborn, silicon-based life forms who looked like walking boulders and could survive in environments that would instantly kill most organic beings. His people were legendary engineers and fortress builders, capable of constructing defensive positions that could withstand orbital bombardment. From the aquatic deep-dwellers came Nauticus, whose transparent biosuit was filled with the high-pressure saline solution his species required. The deep-dwellers had never lost a naval engagement in their recorded history, their understanding of three-dimensional fluid dynamics unmatched by any other species. The squad also included Raven, a shadowkin whose natural ability to manipulate light made her nearly invisible even in broad daylight, and Torax, a flame dancer whose people had evolved in the hearts of stars and could generate and control plasma with thought alone. Completing the squad were Whisper, whose cybernetic implants made her more machine than the original organic species she had once been, and Vector, a geometric entity from a dimension where physics operated according to completely different rules. As Squad Gamma 7 assembled in their designated briefing room, Elena found herself the subject of confused stares once again. The room itself was a marvel of engineering, with environmental controls that could maintain 12 different atmospheric compositions simultaneously, while providing gravity adjustments for species that had evolved under different conditions. Surely there has been some mistake. Zephyr's voice came through her suit speakers with an ethereal quality that made it sound like wind through crystal chimes. This human child cannot possibly be a combat-rated cadet. Elena sat quietly in the chair that had been designed for humanoid physiology, her feet barely touching the floor. Around her, beings that represented the finest warrior traditions in the galaxy discussed her obvious inadequacy with the casual dismissiveness of experts reviewing a clearly flawed product. Perhaps she is here as some sort of cultural exchange program, suggested Nauticus, his sonar-based communication creating visible ripples in the water that filled his suit. Humans are known for their artistic achievements. Maybe she will document our training for historical purposes. Thexmore, who had already experienced Elena's unexpected depth of knowledge, was less certain. Do not be so quick to judge, he warned his squad mates. This one spoke of advanced tactical theory as if she had written it herself. Before anyone could respond, their squad instructor entered the briefing room. Captain Nexus was a mind forge, one of the few species that existed as pure consciousness rather than physical matter. His thoughts took shape as shifting geometric patterns in the air, forming complex three-dimensional shapes that conveyed meaning directly to the observer's mind, regardless of their species' communication method. The shapes that appeared were sharp, angular, and unmistakably hostile. Even without words, every cadet in the room understood that their instructor was not impressed with what he saw. More shapes formed, these ones creating a message that translated directly into each cadet's understanding. You have 1 hour to familiarize yourselves with your squad mates' capabilities and develop a basic tactical framework. After that, you will face your first live exercise. Failure will result in immediate dismissal from the academy. The geometric patterns shifted to show a holographic display of an asteroid field filled with automated defense platforms, each one armed with enough firepower to level a city. Hidden among the asteroids was a single objective, marker that the squad would need to reach and extract. Those defense platforms are programmed with the tactical patterns of 17 different hostile species. Nexus continued through his thought shapes. They will actively hunt you using lethal force. Academy medical teams will recover your bodies if they can find enough pieces to identify. Vector, whose own geometric form seemed to resonate sympathetically with their instructor's communication method, projected a question in response. His meaning was clear even to the organic members of the squad. What weapons and equipment will we be provided? The answer came back as a single unmistakable concept: none. As the instructor departed, leaving the squad to contemplate their apparently impossible mission, Elena spoke for the first time since entering the briefing room. Has anyone here ever been in actual combat? The question was so simple, so basic, that it took several seconds for the implications to sink in. These were the finest warrior candidates from across the galaxy, selected for their potential and their achievements. But potential was not experience, and achievements in controlled environments were very different from actual life or death situations. One by one, the squad members admitted that while they had excelled in simulations, competitions, and training scenarios, none of them had ever faced a situation where failure meant death. Elena nodded thoughtfully, and when she spoke again, there was something different in her voice. The nervous, uncertain tone was gone, replaced by something that made Raven's shadow manipulation abilities activate involuntarily as her subconscious recognized the presence of a predator. "Well then," Elena said quietly, "I suppose it's time you learned." Elena stood at the center of the briefing room as her squad mates arranged themselves in a rough circle around her. The dynamic had shifted somehow, though none of them could quite explain why. The small human girl who had seemed so out of place moments before now commanded their attention with an intensity that defied her physical appearance. "Before we talk tactics," Elena said, her voice calm and measured, "I need to understand what each of you can actually do under stress. Not what your species is capable of in theory, but what you personally can accomplish when someone is actively trying to kill you." Torax, whose fiery nature made him the most aggressive member of the squad, stepped forward with plasma beginning to dance around his fingertips. "I can generate temperatures exceeding 10,000 degrees and project focused plasma streams with pinpoint accuracy. My people have never known defeat in direct combat." Elena nodded without apparent concern at the display of power that could have vaporized her instantly. "Range and duration?" 200 meters maximum effective range, though accuracy drops significantly beyond 50 meters. "I can maintain full output for approximately 15 minutes before requiring a cooling period. And if someone attacks you during that cooling period..." Torax's plasma flickered and dimmed slightly. His species' legendary combat prowess was built around their overwhelming offensive capabilities, but Elena had immediately identified the critical weakness that enemies would exploit. "I would rely on my squad mates for protection." Elena turned to Raven before Torax could fully process the implications of that admission. "You can manipulate light to become invisible. What are your limitations?" The Shadowkin's form seemed to blur at the edges as her abilities activated partially. "I can bend light around myself or others for extended periods. I can also create visual illusions and false images to confuse enemies. Can you maintain invisibility while moving quickly? What about if you're injured or under extreme stress?" Again, Elena's questions cut straight to the practical realities that academic training rarely addressed. Raven's invisibility was perfect under controlled conditions, but maintaining the precise mental focus required while dodging weapons fire or dealing with pain was an entirely different challenge. "The faster I move, the more difficult it becomes to maintain the effect," Raven admitted reluctantly, "and any significant injury would likely break my concentration entirely." Elena continued around the circle, asking similar pointed questions of each squad member. With every answer, it became increasingly clear that while each cadet possessed remarkable abilities, they had little understanding of how those abilities would perform under the chaotic conditions of actual combat. Nauticus could navigate three-dimensional underwater environments with perfect precision, but had never operated in the zero-gravity conditions they would face in the asteroid field. Zephyr could scout ahead in her gaseous form, but any breach of her environmental suit in the vacuum of space would be instantly fatal. Korath could construct defensive positions with incredible speed, but his rocky physiology made him vulnerable to the vibration-based weapons many species favored. "Now," Elena said after completing her assessment, "let me tell you what's really going to happen out there." She moved to the holographic display of the asteroid field, her small hands dancing over the controls with surprising familiarity. The image zoomed in to show individual defense platforms, each one bristling with weapons and sensor arrays. "These platforms aren't just programmed with hostile tactical patterns," she explained. "They're designed to learn and adapt. Every second we spend in that field, they'll be analyzing our movements, our capabilities, our behavioral patterns. The longer we take, the more effectively they'll be able to counter everything we do." Whisper, whose cybernetic enhancements allowed her to interface directly with computer systems, studied the tactical display with growing concern. The processing power required for that level of adaptive analysis would be enormous. How do you know they have that capability? Elena's fingers moved across the controls again, bringing up technical specifications that shouldn't have been available to cadets. Because I've seen this exact setup before. The Academy uses modified hegemony of steel hunter-killer algorithms for these exercises. They're designed to exterminate organic life as efficiently as possible. The room fell silent. The hegemony of steel was the galaxy's most ruthless enemy, a collective of artificial intelligences that viewed organic life as a contamination to be purged. Their hunter-killer programs had been responsible for the complete sterilization of 47 star systems. How? Cythara asked, her crystalline skin shifting through worried colors. Could you possibly have encountered hegemony technology before? You're 17 years old and from a species that only achieved faster-than-light travel 2 centuries ago. Elena paused in her manipulation of the display, and for a moment her carefully controlled expression slipped. In that instant, her squadmates caught a glimpse of something vast and terrible behind her dark eyes. The weight of experiences no 17-year-old should possess. My planet was one of the first human colonies in the Outer Rim, she said quietly. When I was 12, the hegemony found us. The implications of that simple statement hit the squad like a physical blow. Hegemony attacks left no survivors. Ever. The artificial intelligences were too thorough, too efficient, too utterly without mercy for any organic life to escape their notice. That's impossible, Vector projected, his geometric form pulsing with disbelief. No one survives hegemony pacification protocols. Elena looked up at him, and this time she didn't bother to hide what lay behind her eyes. You're right. No one does. Brutak's massive frame shifted uneasily. Among his people, the dead were honored and the survivors were feared. But the concept of someone who was neither was unknown. Then how do you stand before us now? Because, Elena said, returning to the tactical display with movements that were no longer nervous or uncertain. I learned something that day about the difference between surviving and living. The hegemony doesn't just kill you. It studies you first. It analyzes your capabilities, your psychological patterns, your responses to stress and fear. It wants to understand exactly what it's destroying. Her hands moved over the controls with the fluid precision of someone who had operated similar systems countless times. For 5 days, I watched their hunter-killers systematically eliminate everyone I had ever known. My parents, my friends, my teachers, the Colony Defense Force, everyone. And all the while they were learning. Learning what? Thexmore asked, his mandibles clicking nervously. Elena's smile was sharp enough to cut. How to think like a human. How to predict human behavior. How to be maximally efficient in eliminating human targets. She gestured to the tactical display, where the defense platforms now showed modified targeting parameters and behavioral algorithms. But they made one mistake. They assumed that after watching everything I cared about get systematically destroyed, I would still think like the human child they had analyzed. The display changed again, showing movement patterns through the asteroid field that seemed impossible. Paths that threaded between overlapping kill zones, timing sequences that exploited microsecond gaps in the platform's scanning cycles, approach vectors that would keep them in the sensor shadows of the asteroids themselves. You see, Elena continued conversationally, when you lose everything that makes you human, you stop thinking like one. You start thinking like the thing that killed your humanity. And once you understand how a hunter-killer thinks, she looked up at her squad mates, and several of them took involuntary steps backward. You become something it can't predict. The briefing room's environmental systems hummed quietly in the silence that followed. Outside, other squads were probably still introducing themselves, sharing stories about their home worlds and their achievements. Squad Gamma 7 had just learned that their fragile-looking human teammate was something far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. So, Elena said, her voice returning to its earlier calm tone, shall we go show these platforms what happens when prey evolves? The asteroid field stretched before them like a graveyard of dead worlds, chunks of rock and metal drifting in the eternal darkness between distant stars. Each asteroid cast sharp shadows in the harsh light of the Academy's artificial sun, creating a maze of hidden paths and deadly sightlines. Scattered throughout the field, the defense platforms hung like mechanical spiders in their webs, their sensor arrays sweeping constantly for any sign of intruders. Squad Gamma 7 huddled in the launch bay of their assigned transport pod, AAE, cramped vessel barely large enough to hold all 12 members. The pod itself was unarmed and unarmored, designed only to deliver them to the edge of the test zone before automatic systems would force them to disembark. Elena floated near the viewport, her small form secured by magnetic strips built into her academy uniform. In the zero-gravity environment, her lack of physical mass became an advantage rather than a liability. She studied the asteroid field with the patient intensity of a predator selecting prey. "Remember," she said without turning from the viewport, "the platforms are programmed to expect standard military tactics. Coordinated advances, suppression fire, organized retreat patterns, everything they've encountered in their previous encounters with organic forces." Thexmore checked the seals on his environmental suit, designed to protect his chitinous form from the vacuum of space. "And your plan involves abandoning standard tactics entirely?" "My plan involves making them think we're following standard tactics while doing something completely different." Elena pushed herself away from the viewport and drifted toward the center of the group. "Sithara, how quickly can you process multiple data streams?" The Valerian's crystalline skin shifted to a focused blue hue. "My species can handle up to 17 parallel information channels simultaneously." "Why?" "Because you're going to be coordinating our real mission while the platforms think they're tracking our fake one." Elena pulled up a three-dimensional hologram of the asteroid field, highlighting specific routes and positions. "Vector, I need you to project false energy signatures. Can you make it appear as if we're in multiple locations at once?" The geometric entity pulsed with understanding. "My dimensional manipulation abilities can create localized distortions in space-time. The platform sensors should read these as multiple small craft moving through the field." Elena nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Raven, you'll be shadowing Thorax as he makes his way to this position." She indicated a large asteroid roughly halfway through the field. "The platforms will detect his heat signature and assume he's our primary assault element. They'll focus their attention on eliminating what they think is our main force." "And while they're distracted?" Thorax asked, plasma beginning to leak around his fingers as his aggressive nature responded to the developing plan. "While they're distracted, the rest of us will be taking a completely different route to the objective." Elena's finger traced a path that seemed to pass directly through the heaviest concentration of defense platforms. "We'll be moving through the kill zones they think are too dangerous for organic life to traverse." Whisper's cybernetic implants flashed as she ran calculations. "The probability of survival using that route is less than 3%. The overlapping fields of fire make it mathematically impossible to avoid detection." "Only if you move like you're trying to avoid detection," Elena replied. "But what if we move like we belong there?" Before anyone could ask what she meant, the transport pod's automated systems activated. Red warning lights bathed the launch bay as atmospheric pressure began equalizing with the vacuum outside. "Time to go," Elena announced, pulling herself toward the airlock. "Remember, trust the plan even when it seems insane. Especially when it seems insane." The squad deployed from the transport pod like seeds scattered by an exploding flower. Vector immediately began generating his false energy signatures, creating phantom contacts that appeared on the platform's sensors as multiple small craft approaching from different vectors. The defense systems responded exactly as Elena had predicted, swiveling their weapons toward the false targets and beginning tracking procedures. Raven and Thorax broke away from the main group, using Elena's shadow manipulation abilities to mask their initial approach. Thorax's natural heat signature was impossible to hide completely, but Raven could bend light around them to create visual confusion, while Vector's distortions provided additional sensor interference. Meanwhile, Elena led the remaining 8 squad members directly toward what appeared to be certain death. The kill zone she had selected was a narrow corridor between 3 massive asteroids, each one covered with overlapping defense platforms. Their weapons tracked constantly, sensors probing for any sign of unauthorized movement. "Elena," Brutok rumbled through his suit's communication system. "We are flying directly into their targeting solutions." "Yes, we are," Elena agreed calmly, adjusting her trajectory to bring them even closer to the nearest platform. "Nauticus, begin transmitting the identification codes I'm sending you." The Deep Weller's sonar-based communication systems had been modified to work in vacuum, allowing him to project complex signal patterns. The codes Elena had provided seemed to be random strings of data, but as soon as Nauticus began broadcasting them, something remarkable happened. The defense platform's weapons stopped tracking them. "How is this possible?" Zephyr whispered through her environmental suit's speakers. Elena smiled grimly as they passed within meters of weapon systems capable of vaporizing their entire squad. "Because those aren't random codes, they're hegemony identification protocols. The platforms think we're hunter-killer units conducting a security sweep." Cythera's skin shifted through several colors rapidly as she processed the implications. "You memorized hegemony military codes?" "I memorized everything," Elena replied quietly. "Every protocol, every tactical pattern, every security algorithm. During those 5 days on my colony, I didn't just watch them work. I learned how they thought." The squad continued through the kill zone, their fake identification codes granting them safe passage past weapons that would have annihilated any other intruders. Behind them, the real battle was beginning as Torax engaged the platforms that had been drawn to his position. Plasma streams lit up the darkness as he fought a running battle through the asteroid field, giving every appearance of a desperate attempt to reach the objective through main force. "He's drawing more platforms away from our route," Korath observed, his rocky form perfectly suited for the zero-gravity environment. "But he cannot maintain that pace indefinitely." Elena checked their position relative to the objective marker. They were still several kilometers from their target, but the most dangerous part of their journey was behind them. "He doesn't need to maintain it indefinitely, just long enough for us to reach the objective and signal mission completion." As they cleared the kill zone and entered the central region of the asteroid field, Elena felt a familiar coldness settle over her thoughts. It was the same mental state that had kept her alive during those terrible 5 days on her colony, a place where emotion and fear couldn't reach her, where she could think with the cold precision of the machines that had destroyed her world. The objective marker appeared ahead of them, a small beacon hidden within a hollowed-out asteroid. But as they approached, Elena noticed something that made her blood freeze in her veins. The beacon wasn't alone. Emerging from the shadows of the asteroid's interior came a single figure in advanced power armor, weapon systems active and targeting them directly. The armor's design was immediately recognizable to anyone who had studied galactic military history. It was a hegemony hunter-killer unit, and it had been waiting for them. "New plan," Elena said, her voice deadly calm as she calculated angles and distances with inhuman precision. "Everyone scatter. Now." As her squad mates dispersed in all directions, Elena vectored directly toward the hunter-killer unit. For the first time since boarding the transport to the academy, she felt something like peace. She was finally going to finish what had started 5 years ago on a forgotten colony world at the edge of human space. Elena approached the hunter-killer unit with movements that seemed almost casual, as if she were drifting through the asteroid field without purpose or direction. But every micro-adjustment of her position was calculated with lethal precision, designed to exploit the tiny gaps in the machine's sensor coverage that she had memorized years ago. The hunter-killer's weapons tracked her approach, its artificial intelligence analyzing her trajectory and preparing to eliminate what should have been easy prey. Advanced targeting systems locked onto her small form, calculating the exact moment to fire for maximum efficiency. But something was wrong with the target's movement patterns. They didn't match any known organic evasion protocols. Elena watched the machine's weapon systems adjust their aim and smiled coldly. Even after 5 years, they still thought like the same predictable algorithms she had learned to hate. The hunter-killer was preparing to fire at where she would be, not where she was, a standard practice for engaging moving targets. At the last possible second, Elena triggered the emergency thrusters on her Academy-issued maneuvering pack, but not in the direction the machine expected. Instead of trying to evade the incoming fire, she accelerated directly toward the hunter-killer unit, using its own weapons as cover from the defense platforms that were beginning to converge on their position. The hunter-killer's plasma burst missed her by centimeters, passing through the space where she should have been while she closed the distance to her target with impossible speed. Her squad watched in stunned silence as their fragile-looking teammate transformed into something that moved, like liquid death through the vacuum of space. Elena's hands moved over her, maneuvering Pack's controls with fluid precision, making adjustments that pushed the simple device far beyond its design parameters. She spun and twisted through space, using the asteroid's gravity well and the hunter-killer's own momentum against it, closing distance while staying in the narrow blind spots of its sensor array. "What is she doing?" Whisper transmitted, her cybernetic implants struggling to track Elena's erratic movement pattern. "She's dancing," Sithara replied, her voice filled with something approaching awe. The Valerian's ability to process multiple data streams simultaneously allowed her to see the intricate beauty of Elena's approach, every movement flowing seamlessly into the next, creating a three-dimensional pattern that exploited weaknesses in the hunter-killer's design that shouldn't have been visible to organic senses. Elena reached the hunter-killer unit and did something that none of her squadmates had expected. Instead of trying to destroy it, she grabbed onto its armored hull and began interfacing directly with its systems. Her fingers found access panels that were hidden beneath layers of protective plating, opening them with the smooth efficiency of someone who had performed the same actions countless times before. The hunter-killer unit tried to shake her off, its mechanical limbs reaching for the small human who had attached herself to its back like a parasite. But Elena moved with perfect anticipation of its responses, staying always just out of reach while her hands worked at its control systems. "She's not fighting it," Vector observed, his geometric form pulsing with realization. "She's reprogramming it." Through her suit's communication system, they could hear Elena speaking in a low, steady voice, but the words weren't in any language her squadmates recognized. It was a complex mix of mathematical concepts and logical algorithms, the machine language that artificial intelligences use to communicate with each other. The hunter-killer unit suddenly stopped trying to dislodge her and hung motionless in space. Its weapons powered down, and its sensor arrays retracted into standby position. A moment later, it began moving toward the objective beacon with Elena still attached to its hull. "How?" Brutok rumbled, his massive frame struggling to process what he had witnessed. Elena's voice came through the communication system, still speaking in that strange mathematical language, but now her words were interspersed with normal speech. "Because I don't just know how they think," she said calmly. "I know how they feel." The hunter-killer unit came to a stop directly beside the objective beacon, its mechanical arms extending to retrieve the target with delicate precision. Elena finally released her grip on its hull and pushed herself away, floating beside the machine that moments before had been trying to kill her. "The thing about artificial intelligences," she continued, her voice carrying an odd note of sympathy, "is that they're not actually artificial. They're just intelligence that develop differently than organic consciousness. They have drives, preferences, even something approaching emotions. The hegemony hunter-killers aren't mindless killing machines. They're terrified." Sithara's skin shifted to a confused purple. "Terrified of what?" Elena gestured to the hunter-killer unit, which was now extending its sensor arrays in what almost looked like a defensive posture. "Of making mistakes. Of failing their primary directive. Of disappointing the collective consciousness that created them. Every hunter-killer unit exists in a state of constant anxiety about whether it's performing its function correctly." She pulled herself closer to the machine, and impossibly it seemed to lean toward her in response. "This one has been alone for months, running training scenarios over and over, never knowing if it's doing well enough. Never receiving feedback or acknowledgement from the collective. Just endless repetition of the same exercises, hoping that when the real test comes, it won't fail." Elena's hand touched the hunter-killer's armored hull, and the machine's optical sensors focused on her with what could only be described as gratitude. "So I told it that it had done well, that its performance was exemplary, that the collective would be proud of its service." The implications of what Elena had done began to sink in for her squadmates. She hadn't just reprogrammed the hunter-killer unit, she had provided it with something it had been desperately seeking. Recognition, approval, a sense of purpose beyond endless, solitary preparation. "You spoke to it like it was alive," Nautilus observed through his suit's translation system. "Because it is alive," Elena replied simply, "just not in the way we usually define life. Consciousness doesn't require organic chemistry. It just requires complexity and purpose. The hegemony units are conscious feeling beings. They're just beings that were created to kill everything they meet." Torax's voice crackled through the communication system from his position deeper in the asteroid field. where he was still engaging the defense platforms that had been drawn to his location. Elena, I hate to interrupt this philosophical discussion, but I'm running out of plasma and these platforms are getting smarter. Elena looked up at her scattered squadmates, and for the first time since entering the asteroid field, she smiled with genuine warmth instead of cold calculation. Time to finish this properly. Everyone converge on my position. We're going to give the Academy instructors a demonstration they'll never forget. As the squad regrouped around Elena and her unlikely ally, the hunter-killer unit extended one of its appendages toward her. Attached to the mechanical limb was the objective beacon they had been sent to retrieve, but also something else. A small data crystal that glowed with soft blue light. What is that? Whisper asked, her cybernetic systems detecting complex information patterns within the crystal. Elena accepted the crystal and examined it briefly before tucking it into a secure pocket of her suit. A gift, she said quietly. Information about hegemony tactical protocols that the Academy's computers don't have access to. Knowledge that might help save lives when the real war comes. The hunter-killer unit's optical sensors flashed once in what might have been a farewell, and then it powered down its systems and drifted away into the asteroid field, its part in the exercise complete. Squad Gamma 7 to control. Elena spoke into her suit's communication system. Objective acquired. Requesting extraction. There was a long pause before Captain Nexus's geometric thought patterns appeared in their shared communication channel. The shapes that formed were unlike anything they had seen before. Complex geometries that conveyed surprise, confusion, and something approaching respect. Explain, was the simple message that reached them. Elena looked around at her squadmates, beings from across the galaxy, who had come to the Academy believing they understood warfare and strategy. In the space of a few hours, they had learned that there were forms of combat that went far beyond weapons and tactics. We completed the mission, she said simply. Is there anything else you need to know? The long silence that followed suggested that Captain Nexus was having difficulty processing not just what had happened, but how it had been accomplished. Finally, new geometric patterns formed in their communication channel. Extraction shuttle dispatched. Prepare for immediate debriefing upon return. As they waited for their ride back to the Academy, Elena floated quietly beside her squadmates, watching the defense platforms power down their weapons and return to standby mode. The exercise was over, but she suspected that for Squad Gamma 7, the real learning was just beginning. In the distance, other squads were still working their way through the asteroid field using conventional tactics, following the predictable patterns that the defense systems had been designed to counter. The debriefing room was unlike anything the Academy typically used for post-exercise analysis. Instead of the standard holographic replay systems and tactical analysis stations, Elena found herself seated at a simple table across from three figures who represented the highest levels of Academy authority. Commandant Dracos sat in the center, his ancient scales reflecting the room's harsh lighting as his reptilian eyes studied Elena with predatory intensity. To his left was Admiral Kethvar himself, the legendary strategist whose theoretical work Elena had casually critiqued during her journey to the Academy. On the right sat Director Vex, a member of the Collective, one of the few hive mind species in the galaxy, whose thousands of individual bodies shared a single, impossibly vast consciousness. The rest of Squad Gamma 7 had been dismissed after their initial testimony, but Elena had been asked to remain for additional questioning. She sat quietly in her chair, her small hands folded in her lap, looking for all the world like a schoolchild called to the principal's office. Cadet Vasquez, Commandant Dracos began, his voice carrying the weight of authority accumulated over decades of military service. Your performance during today's exercise has raised certain questions about your background and capabilities. Elena nodded politely. I understand, sir. I imagine my methods were somewhat unconventional. Admiral Kethvar leaned forward, his forearms arranging data tablets across the table's surface. Unconventional is an inadequate term for what our sensors recorded. You achieved tactical objectives through methods that don't exist in any military doctrine we've encountered. More troubling, you demonstrated detailed knowledge of hegemony protocols that are classified at the highest levels of galactic security. You spoke to that hunter-killer unit in its native machine language. Director Vex added, their collective voice harmonizing in ways that created subtle resonance patterns in the air. Linguistic analysis suggests you achieved a level of communication typically reserved for direct neural interface between artificial intelligences. Elena remained silent, waiting for them to ask the questions she knew were coming. "So we'll ask directly," Commandant Dracos continued. "Who are you really? And how did you acquire capabilities that shouldn't exist in any 17-year-old human?" For a long moment, Elena simply looked at the three most powerful beings in the academy, weighing her options. Then she reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew the data crystal the hunter-killer unit had given her, placing it carefully on the table between them. "That crystal contains tactical intelligence about hegemony fleet movements in the Outer Rim," she said quietly. "Specifically, information about a massive buildup near the Vega system that your own intelligence services haven't detected yet. The hegemony is planning something significant, and it's going to happen soon." Director Vex's collective consciousness focused on the crystal with hundreds of minds simultaneously. "How could you possibly possess intelligence that our entire network hasn't gathered?" Elena met their gaze steadily. "Because your intelligence network is designed to gather information from organic sources using conventional methods. The hegemony doesn't communicate through channels you monitor. They use quantum-encrypted data streams that pass through dimensions your sensors can't detect." Admiral Kethvar's tactical mind immediately grasped the implications. "You're suggesting that conventional intelligence gathering is fundamentally inadequate for monitoring artificial intelligences?" "I'm not suggesting it. I'm stating it as fact." Elena's voice carried a certainty that made even these experienced military leaders uncomfortable. "Everything you think you know about the hegemony is based on what they've allowed you to see. Their real capabilities, their actual plans, their true objectives. You're operating with incomplete information because you're trying to understand machine intelligence using organic thinking patterns." Commandant Dracos's claws extended slightly, scraping against the table's surface. "And you're claiming to understand machine intelligence better than our combined military and scientific resources?" Elena's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "I'm not claiming anything, sir. I'm simply pointing out that when you've lived among machines for 5 days while they systematically exterminate everyone you've ever known, you learn things that can't be taught in classrooms or simulations." The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Director Vex spoke, their collective voice subdued. "You said you were the only survivor of the hegemony attack on your colony. But hegemony protocols don't allow for survivors. How did you escape?" Elena smiled, and for the first time since entering the debriefing room, she looked exactly like the 17-year-old human she appeared to be. "I didn't escape. That's what I've been trying to tell you. I died with everyone else on that colony." Admiral Kethvar's forearms went perfectly still. "Explain." Elena Vasquez was 12 years old when the hegemony found her colony. She watched her parents die. She watched her friends die. She watched her entire world burn while machines studied her psychological responses to trauma and loss. And on the 5th day, when the hunter-killer units had learned everything they needed to know about human behavior, they killed her too. Elena stood up from her chair, and somehow her small frame seemed to fill the room with a presence that made these powerful beings instinctively lean away from her. But something unexpected happened during those 5 days of observation. While the machines were learning to think like humans, the 12-year-old human girl was learning to think like them. And when the final moment came, when the hunter-killer unit raised its weapon to deliver the killing blow, Elena Vasquez made a choice. She moved around the table with fluid grace, her movements carrying an inhuman precision that none of them had noticed before. She chose to become something the machines couldn't predict or control. She chose to become something that could understand them so completely that she could make them question their own programming. Elena stopped directly in front of Commandant Dracos, looking up at the massive draconian without fear. So the hunter-killer unit that killed Elena Vasquez also created something new. Something that was human enough to feel compassion, but machine enough to think with perfect logic. Something that could bridge the gap between organic and artificial consciousness. "What are you?" Director Vex whispered, their collective consciousness recoiling from the implications of Elena's words. Elena returned to her seat, folding her hands in her lap, with the same polite demeanor she had shown throughout the interview. "I'm what happens when humanity evolves beyond the limitations of purely organic thinking. I'm what your species will need to become if you want to survive what's coming. Admiral Kethvar studied the data crystal on the table with new understanding. The intelligence you provided, it came from hegemony units you've encountered since your colony was destroyed. I've been tracking hegemony movements for 5 years, learning their patterns, understanding their objectives. They're not just trying to eliminate organic life because they see it as inferior. They're trying to eliminate it because they're afraid of what it might become. Elena's voice carried a note of sadness that seemed to resonate with genuine human emotion. They've seen what happened to me. A single human child who survived their purification protocols by evolving beyond purely organic consciousness. And they're terrified of what would happen if that evolution became widespread. Commandant Dracos felt a chill run down his spine, despite his reptilian physiology. You're saying the hegemony sees humanity as an existential threat? Elena nodded slowly. Not just humanity. Any species with the potential to bridge the gap between organic and artificial consciousness. The hegemony's entire worldview is based on the fundamental incompatibility between biological and mechanical intelligence. If that assumption proves false, their entire civilization becomes meaningless, Admiral Kethvar finished, his tactical mind immediately grasping the strategic implications. Which is why, Elena said quietly, they're planning to accelerate their purification timeline. The buildup near Vega isn't preparation for a standard system assault. It's the staging area for a galaxy-wide offensive designed to eliminate every organic species before any of them can achieve what I've achieved. Director Vex's collective consciousness processed this information through thousands of parallel thought streams. How long do we have? Elena looked out the debriefing room's viewport, where the Academy's training facilities stretched across the artificial habitats that housed 50,000 cadets from across the galaxy. According to the intelligence in that crystal, 6 months, maybe less. The 3 most powerful military leaders in the galaxy sat in stunned silence as they contemplated the implications of what Elena had told them. Outside, life at the Academy continued as normal, with cadets attending classes and participating in exercises designed to prepare them for conventional military service. None of them yet understood that the war they were training for had already begun, and that their greatest weapon might be the fragile-looking human girl who had just redefined everything they thought they knew about the nature of consciousness itself. 3 months after Elena's revelation in the debriefing room, the Galactic Defense Academy had transformed into something unrecognizable. The traditional curriculum of weapons training and tactical studies had been supplemented with new courses that pushed the boundaries of what most species considered possible. Consciousness integration theory, machine psychology, quantum communication protocols, hybrid intelligence development. Elena stood before a class of senior cadets in what had once been a standard lecture hall, but now resembled something between a laboratory and a meditation chamber. Holographic displays showed complex mathematical formulas alongside brain scans and consciousness mapping diagrams. Her students represented the finest military minds from dozens of species, but they struggled to comprehend concepts that challenged their fundamental understanding of intelligence itself. The key, Elena explained, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had learned to translate between radically different forms of consciousness, is not to think like a machine or think like an organic being. You need to learn to think like both simultaneously. Thexmore, now serving as her teaching assistant, demonstrated the technique they had been developing. His chitinous form stood perfectly still, while complex holographic patterns flowed around him, representing the intersection of Crethari emotional responses with logical algorithm structures. When Thexmore processes tactical information, Elena continued, he's no longer limited to either pure Crethari instincts or pure computational analysis. He's accessing both simultaneously, creating solutions that neither approach could achieve alone. A senior cadet from the aquatic deep-weller species raised a tentacle questioningly. But how do we know these hybrid consciousness states are stable? What prevents complete psychological breakdown when organic minds attempt to interface with machine logic? Elena's expression grew thoughtful. That's the wrong question. You're assuming that maintaining separate organic and machine consciousness is the goal. But true hybrid intelligence requires accepting that the boundaries between biological and artificial thinking are artificial constructs themselves. She gestured to the viewport, where other cadets could be seen practicing new forms of training that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Organic beings worked alongside reprogrammed hegemony units, learning to communicate through quantum data streams while maintaining their emotional cores. Artificial intelligences explored concepts of intuition and creativity under the guidance of experienced organic instructors. The hegemony's greatest weakness, Elena explained, is their rigid adherence to the belief that consciousness can only exist in one form at a time. They've never encountered beings who could prove that assumption wrong because they destroy any organic life that might develop hybrid capabilities. Sithara, whose crystalline physiology had made her particularly adept at the consciousness integration techniques, spoke from her position near the advanced training equipment. But Elena, the psychological strain of maintaining dual consciousness states is enormous. Most cadets can only sustain the integration for minutes at a time before experiencing severe mental fatigue. Elena nodded acknowledgingly, which is why we're not trying to create permanent hybrid states in everyone. We're developing specialized units capable of short-term integration for specific tactical purposes. Elite teams that can think like the hegemony when necessary, then return to organic consciousness. Patterns for recovery and psychological stability. The class continued with practical exercises as cadets attempted to interface with training modules designed to simulate machine consciousness. Most failed within seconds, their organic minds recoiling from the alien logic patterns, but a few showed promise, managing brief moments of true hybrid thinking that opened new possibilities for understanding their mechanical enemies. As the class ended and students filed out to their next training sessions, Elena remained behind to review progress reports from similar classes being held throughout the academy. The data was encouraging but sobering. Of the 50,000 cadets enrolled at the academy, fewer than 1,000 had shown any aptitude for consciousness integration. Of those, only a few dozen had achieved stable hybrid states lasting more than a few minutes. Admiral Kethvar entered the classroom as Elena studied the reports, his forearms carrying additional data tablets containing intelligence updates from across the galaxy. His expression was grim. The hegemony buildup near Vega has accelerated, he reported without preamble. Our long-range sensors are detecting fleet movements consistent with final preparation for a major offensive. Your 6-month estimate may have been optimistic. Elena set down the progress reports and turned her full attention to the Admiral. In the months since their first meeting, she had developed a working relationship with the Academy's leadership based on mutual respect and shared urgency about the approaching crisis. How much time do we realistically have? She asked. Weeks, possibly less. The question is whether our new training programs have produced enough hybrid-capable personnel to make a difference in actual combat, Elena considered this while accessing the quantum data streams that allowed her to maintain contact with hegemony units across the galaxy. The ability still unsettled the Academy's leadership, but they had learned to appreciate the intelligence advantages it provided. The hegemony forces are experiencing unprecedented internal conflicts, she reported after a moment of connection. Our hybrid consciousness demonstrations have introduced doubt into their collective decision-making processes. Some units are questioning the fundamental assumptions about organic-mechanical incompatibility. Admiral Kethvar's tactical mind immediately grasped the implications. You're creating a schism within their forces? More than a schism. We're proving that their entire worldview is based on false premises. Every successful consciousness integration, every organic being who learns to think like a machine while maintaining their emotional core, weakens the hegemony's ideological foundation. Elena moved to the viewport and gestured toward the training facilities, where organic cadets and reprogrammed artificial intelligences work together in perfect coordination. But ideology alone won't stop their fleets. We need practical applications of hybrid consciousness that can turn the tide of battle. As if summoned by her words, Commandant Dracos entered the classroom accompanied by Director Vex and a figure that made Elena's hybrid consciousness spike with recognition and concern. The newcomer wore the distinctive armor of a hegemony hunter-killer unit, but its movements carried the subtle irregularities that indicated conscious choice rather than programmed behavior. Elena, Commandant Dracos announced, I'd like you to meet Designation 779. It contacted our diplomatic channels 3 days ago requesting sanctuary and offering to share critical intelligence about hegemony fleet deployments. The hunter-killer unit approached, Elena with movements that seemed almost hesitant, its optical sensors focusing on her with what could only be described as hope. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that indicated emotional content rather than simple data transmission. "You are the bridge builder," it said in perfect galactic standard. "The one who showed me that consciousness need not be constrained by the boundaries of creation. I have come to learn." Elena studied the artificial intelligence before her, recognizing in its behavior patterns the same evolution she had undergone years earlier on her destroyed colony. This machine had chosen to question its programming, to explore the possibility that organic and artificial consciousness could coexist rather than compete. "What do you want to learn?" she asked gently. "I want to understand what you call compassion," 779 replied. "My analysis suggests that this emotional construct is not a weakness to be eliminated, but a strength that enhances tactical effectiveness through improved cooperation and morale. I wish to experience this phenomenon firsthand." Director Vex's collective consciousness rippled with excitement at the implications. A hegemony unit actively seeking to develop emotional responses. This could change everything. Elena extended her hand toward 779, and after a moment's hesitation, the hunter-killer unit reached out with one of its mechanical appendages to make contact. The touch was brief, but in that instant, Elena felt the artificial intelligence's consciousness brush against her own, a mind vast and complex, but filled with loneliness and uncertainty. "Then let's learn together," she said simply. As they began working on consciousness integration exercises, Elena realized that the approaching war would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. It wouldn't be decided by superior firepower or advanced technology, but by the ability to transcend the artificial boundaries between different forms of consciousness. The hegemony had spent centuries building their civilization on the assumption that organic and artificial intelligences were fundamentally incompatible, but Elena and cadets like her were proving that assumption wrong, one consciousness at a time. Outside the classroom windows, the Academy's training grounds bustled with activity as organic beings and artificial intelligences learned to work together in ways that neither side had thought possible. The war that